Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we're going to continue our series learning iOS development with Swift 4. In this video specifically, we're going to cover Xcode 9 and go through its interface and create our very first application. So let's get started. So in our previous videos, we've installed Xcode and played around with our playgrounds and showed you a little bit about Swift 4. Let's get started actually building an iOS application. So with this screen open, and if you don't see it, you could always access it via File New and go to New Project. But we're going to create a new project from here. So click on that little button and it should open up a little selector here where we can choose our templates. So the first one that's selected is single view app. We can create a game or augmented reality application, document-based app, master detail app, etc. For this video, we're going to keep it simple and just choose single view application and click next. The next thing it's going to do is ask you the name of this product. So we're going to just type in first iOS app. Okay, and the organization name you want to put in, and we're going to put a space there. And the organization identifier is going to be your website in reverse domain naming convention here. So we're going to put the com before. If you're a .NET, you'd put net dot and then your website. If you don't have a website, you can always just put your name. This name needs to be unique on the App Store once we're ready to submit it to the App Store. And a great way is just to use your website because only you have that website name. And so again, this is going to be the bundle identifier for the application, and it has to be unique. This also will append at the end your product name, and so we just have first iOS app at the end of that. And so this whole thing makes that unique. Next is the language. Make sure that Swift is selected, which should be by the default. And then uncheck use core data if that is selected. I think it's selected on the first run. And you can have these include unit tests and UI tests checked if you want to. We can get to those later. Let's go ahead and hit next on that. And choose a spot to save it. I'm actually going to create a new folder called iOS development. If I can spell it, there we go. And I'm going to stick all of our projects in there. It'll create a subdirectory with our project. If you do not have a Git repository, you can go ahead and check that and it'll automatically add that. And so let's just go ahead and do that and create. Great. And so the pop-up that you have in here, usually on the first run, is going to ask if Xcode Beta, which is the current version I'm using, would like to access your contacts. This is for using the Git repository. You can collaborate with other users, and instead of their username and email, you can actually pull in their real name based on the contacts that you have in your address book. Just makes it a little bit nicer that way. So choose what you want. But we're going to look at this interface a little bit. And so right here on the left-hand side, let's kind of start on the left, we have all of our files in our project. And Xcode has gone ahead and actually created a whole bunch for us and put them into different folders. So we have a folder for the unit tests here, and I'm going to click on that disclosure arrow to hide it. And then the next one we have is a UI test, a couple of things. You can explore that if you want in more detail. And then up here in our first folder is where we actually have the files that we'll be accessing here in a second. But another folder I wanted to call out is the products folder. If you select that, this is what actually gets generated when you create your application. So we have our first iOS app, .app, that's going to go ahead and be the file that is the compiled version of our application. Okay, so in this file explorer that we also have another tab up here. Because we have a Git repository attached to this, we can see the different aspects of our Git repository. We have a master branch here, we have tags if we had any, and the remotes that we don't have anything set up here. But if you wanted to hook this up to GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, etc., or your own private server, you'd set up your remotes here, etc. This works just like it does with any other Git repository. You can do it with command line, etc. But we also have this source control menu up here that gives us a little bit more functionality there as well. So moving on, we have another tab up here just for the hierarchy for your different classes that you have. So we have a ViewController class, which is pretty much our only class in here besides the Appdelegate, which we'll get to in a second. And then inside we have different ways to go and access the functions. So we have two functions down here. One is did receive memory warning when the device runs low on memory, I should say. And then view did load. The view did load is going to be the entry point into this view controller. So basically when the view is done loading, this will get called. A lot of people use this for setting up their widgets, making references, changing the display right before it gets shown to the user on the display, which we have another method called view did appear. So we'll get to those in a second. Let's move on. We have the ability to search across our application using this tab up here in the top left. And so if we type in something like view did, or just view did, let me put that in, we can see that we have two instances, but both of those are going to be in the ViewController.swift file of our application. So there's the instance of it, and then it's calling super.viewDidLoad to call the super class, which comes from UI ViewController. So we always have to call the super class's version of that so that UI ViewController can set up a bunch of its own things and that sort of thing. So we do the same thing in did receive memory warning, and again, these are only done in overridden functions. Okay, the next tab we have is our errors and build time warnings. This shouldn't show anything at the moment, but if we go ahead and compile using this play button, then you might hopefully don't see any warnings on your application or errors, but if you do, they'll appear up there. Next thing we have is a couple tests here. We can go ahead and select the test and it'll jump to that. We can run them individually, or we can run them all based on that test case, which is also selectable up here. So it's a really nice way of running either the whole test case, which will run all the sub tests under it, or again, we can run each individual test. That's the setup and teardown. These are the actual tests down here, this one and this one. Just a quick note, setup is what happens before the test, and then the teardown happens after the test. So we don't have any code in there, but if we did, that's where it would be. The next is the debug menu here. This also has our stack traces and other things in here, and we'll get to that when we talk about debugging. Next is our breakpoint. So if we wanted to add a breakpoint here and here, they would show up in this list, and then we could quickly jump back and forth between them, or we can drag them off, and you can see the X for my cursor. That'll delete it, or I can disable it by clicking on the breakpoint. If I click on it again, it'll toggle it back and forth, on and off, and then I can click and hold and drag that off as well until my cursor turns into the X and delete it. Let's actually go back to our file menu and go back to our view controller. Let's put a breakpoint right there. And so as we run our application, there is no debug or other mode. There's just one way of running our application. So you don't have to worry about running it in debug mode to get these breakpoints. And if you don't know what we're talking about, just hold on tight. We'll get to there in a second. Okay, so the next thing we have here is the report navigator. We'll talk about that later in videos, but let's move on to above this, which I kind of mentioned before, was the play button. If we click and hold on this, we can actually run several different things. So we can actually run a test that will run our unit tests and UI tests. We could do a profile, which will profile the application so that we can test its memory, its CPU usage, a bunch of other things like that, and see how well our application is running. All right, so I'm going to hit the play button and we're going to build this application. And you can see that the first time we run this, it'll start to load the operating system. I'm loading an iPhone 7 Plus on iOS 11. We can press the home button, we can press the power button, we can press the toggle volume, basically the mute button, volume up, volume down, etc. Okay, and once our application is up and running, you should see the white screen. And that's all of our application. It's just a blank screen because that's the template that we selected. Now that view controller is loaded, it did take a second or two the first time, but the view controller did load, and we're going to stop here in our code on view did load. Now from here, what we can do is we can use what we learned in the playgrounds by printing out a statement, and I'm just going to say did load our initial view. Okay, and that's not going to run at the moment. I'd have to recompile and run our application, but we can remove this breakpoint or disable it. If you want to disable all breakpoints across all the application, we can go to our breakpoints list and click on each one individually, yada yada. Or you can go down here and click on this one. This will deactivate all breakpoints across your application. So if you're not interested in debugging your application anymore, you can simply deactivate all of them across your entire application. And as you develop stuff, you'll get a bunch of breakpoints in there. So that's a really handy way to use. If you do not see this menu down here, this window, you could always access that up in the top right hand corner. You click that and that will toggle that in and out, and you should see the bottom stuff here. I'm gonna make that a little bit bigger. All right, so now we've run our application. Let's go ahead and stop it. The next thing I want to show you is our schemes. You probably don't need to worry about this initially, but we do have the ability to add new schemes for various versions of our application, whether you want to actually make a debug build or you want to make a special build with special parameters, that sort of thing. You probably do that in the scheme, add a new scheme here. But we're going to just use the default one. If you hover over it, it'll give you access to the different simulators or devices if you have those connected to your computer. But you can also access that simply by just clicking on this one and maybe scrolling up and down. And so we can see what our application looks on all these different simulators. And again, if you have one connected to your computer, you can select it there. All right, so then the next one we have is output from whatever we just did. So we built our application, we stopped it, and it said finish running our first iOS application on the iPhone 7 Plus. This will also give you build warnings and errors and other information like that. Going across to the top right, we have the different views that we have for our code editor. So this one is just the normal one. If you want to get more into a little bit more advanced code editing, you could hit this button. It'll do like a side-by-side. You could have multiple let's see, we could just go to different applications. You can see different windows. You can put UI editors there, and you can select the different applications, different files, excuse me, that we have, like the Appdelegate, etc. We'll come back to this in a second. But if you click and hold on that, we have other types of those views as well. Actually, I'm going to switch that back to the one on the right. And then next we have a version editor for Git. And so because we have this hooked up to Git, we can actually do a comparison view of that file. If you select that, so I added this line of code, and so it'll say that this is new, and I can discard that change or whatever you want to do. So it's a really nice way of seeing what the previous version was and then seeing what we've edited here. We also have blame view, which is really handy. So you can see who actually edited these various different lines of code. Always helpful if there's a bug and you need to either ask the original author a question or figure out who introduced the bug in the first place. And then finally, we have Git Log, which will, as you commit your code to the repository, when you put in a commit message, that'll show up in those lines. And so for this particular one, when I added this, when I checked that box for Git and version control, it automatically said this is the initial commit, committed all my files. And we can see that if we go back to our Explorer view, that this file, ViewController, where I have print here, is now modified. That's what that M stands for. And if you hold down Option Command C, it'll bring down our commit editor, and we can type in a commit message here. Right now this one is staged, and this is our Git kind of controller that we can use with Git. Of course, we don't have to use that. You can always use the command line or source tree or something, whatever your favorite way of editing and committing Git is. Okay, and then we kind of touched upon this before. Actually, let me go back to our regular code editor. But now we have the different side panels that we can show. So this is our Navigator. We can hide the Navigator, which is the left panel there, and show it. The bottom debug area, which usually has our step over, continue, those buttons. It'll have some variables. And actually, let's go ahead and play this so we can see that. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we have our inspector, and we can show and hide that as well, just like all the other panels. All right, so once our application is loading, our debug is disabled, so we shouldn't see any stoppage of the code there. But we did have our print statement, which came from this, so we know that that already got executed. And if we had any variables, they would show up here if the code stopped. But in this view, we have a couple ways of actually editing the file that we currently selected. So we have our ViewController here. If you just select that, it'll give us some information about the file itself. So which target is it included in? If you have images, make sure that those are included in your application. That means when they're compiled, they'll be included in the application bundle themselves. So that's some of the ways that you would edit it there. The location relative to group, you can do absolute path. You shouldn't really have to worry about any of that stuff for the most part. All right, let's jump out of ViewController.swift and introduce you to the Appdelegate real quick. The Appdelegate is actually going to be where all of the code exists for our application to handle some of the outer lying functionality of it. So let's give you an example starting from the top. So, this is application. Did finish launching with options, and it gives us a parameter for those options. And it tells us also a little bit about the application itself. And then it'll return a Boolean. So this function is our first ability to put in any code or set up any code as soon as the application launches. This is going to get called way before our view did load in our ViewController. So if you want to set up anything like analytics or something that just needs to be, created as soon as possible, this is usually a good place to do that. The next one we have is application will resign active. This is kind of a callback to us to let us know that the application is going to kind of go in the background state. We also have another one which did enter background, letting us know that the application's already there. This one is going to let us know that the application will enter the foreground. So somebody's coming back to our application. Maybe they switched off to another application, which those two functions above will get called. And then when they're ready to return to our application, will enter foreground gets called. But then more specifically, the application did become active means that it's now up on the screen, it's active, and we can start doing anything. If you're making a game, maybe this is a little bit clearer. Will resign active will let us know that it's going to go. Somebody's done something. They've hit the home button, or they're getting a call and they switch to the application. This is letting you know that that's about to happen, and so we might want to pause the game, and so stuff doesn't happen. Enemies don't start attacking us. And then application did enter background lets us know that everything's done. The application is now running in the background, and we can do anything that we want to do, that we need to do, in order to handle this. So we might save the game and that sort of thing. And so just do be aware that there is a difference between will do something and did do something. And then finally, if somebody wants to close their application, if you double tap with your finger on the home button and then you swipe up on the actual application, that will terminate the application, not just pause it. And so we get a callback to let us know that that's going to happen. So if we have any unsaved data, absolutely make sure that we save it here, as well as maybe doing that when the application will resign active as well. When we talk about core data, which is an embedded database in our mobile application, we want to make sure that that data is saved to the database, and so we might actually make those calls in one of these functions. Okay, so that's the Appdelegate. Normally, when you're first starting, you probably don't need to enter in any code here. I like to keep this file as clean as possible. You do not want to write a whole bunch of code in here, because this is going to be the file that's handling the tasks of the entire application itself. So you don't want to put any class-specific stuff in here. Okay, so the next thing that I want to call out is our main storyboards. Go ahead and click on main.storyboard if you're following along. Let's get rid of some of these windows so we can actually see this. Now, this is the famous white screen that pops up when we launch our simulator. So let's actually add some widgets and make this useful. Down here in the lower right-hand corner, and again, if you don't see this panel, just click up in the top right. And if you click over on... So initially we have our classes here, and this isn't going to be too useful for us for our interface builder. But if you go over here to our objects, we have a whole bunch of objects that we can add to this interface builder. And I can drag this around if I want to, move it over here. This initial arrow is just going to say that this is going to be our initial view controller. Our initial view controller is going to be the controller that controls this view, essentially the code behind this view. So we can create another view controller by clicking and dragging in the right hand and dragging this out onto our interface builder screen here. And again, connect these, move these around, and we can have two different interfaces here. Now, the interesting part is actually further down. So if you scroll down here, we have some labels. So I'm going to drag this label in. I'm going to drag another label in here. You can alternatively, if you don't want to always have to find labels and you already have one on the screen, you can hold down the Option key, click on the label, and then drag somewhere else, and it'll just duplicate that. And I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. I'm just going to double click on this, and I'm just going to call this first. This is going to be our first view controller that gets applied to the screen. I'm going to drag this around till you see that blue center line. Now that I have this selected and making sure our right panel is still open, I'm going to go over to this little slider icon, click on it. This is our attributes, and we can affect the look and feel of this label. So I'm going to go ahead and center that, and let's make it maybe a little bit bigger. You can also select the font by clicking on this T, and instead of a system font, we can do a bunch of text styles, captions, footnotes, etc. Maybe a title is probably a little bit more appropriate. Make that a little bit bigger. That looks good. Maybe you can play with that a little bit more, but I think that suits our purposes for right now. The second one, we just want to differentiate between our first view controller and our second. All right, and I'm just going to recenter that. And great. Next thing we want to do is maybe add a button. And I'm going to double click this. I'm going to say just next and hit enter to save that. All right, so we have two view controllers. They have some interesting things on them now. You can add text fields and sliders and all the different UI widgets that you're probably familiar with if you've ever used iOS. We have them all in here, and you can play around with them. But one thing is important is once you kind of learn one of these widgets, all the other widgets work in a very, very similar manner. We'll get to that in a second. But what I want to do is I want to make this button show this second view controller. Okay, so the easiest way to do this is hold down the control button and click on, while the control button's selected, left click and drag from the button to the second view controller. Make sure it's over this window here. It says view controller down in the bottom right hand corner. Just make sure it's over there and let it go. And you can let go of the control button as well. So this is what is called creating a segue. And the segue, it's going to ask us which kind of segue do we want to create. Action segue. Do we want to show the second view controller? Yes, this is going to be the one that we're going to use. We can show a detail, which is slightly different. Present modally, which will kind of slide up as a modal or a popover or something custom. We're just going to do show to keep it simple. And that's going to create this segue. And so we can actually click on it. We can get some information on it on the right-hand side. We can create an identifier so we can refer to it in code. We can even use a different class for it, etc., etc. So a couple options there. But let's go ahead and run our application and see what we did. We can stop it or just hit the play button twice, or play when it's stopped, and this will launch it. Okay, so we have our first view controller here in all of its beautiful widget layout that I've done. But if you click on the next button, you can see that second view controller slid up. But unfortunately, we don't have any way of dismissing this. So we have no way of going back to the first because there's no other interaction here. So I can hit the home button if I want, and that'll put us back to the home screen, go back to our application. So let's create another button to go back to the first view controller. So I'm going to go ahead and drag in a button here, or you can option select that button. But when you do that, it copies everything over. So what I'm going to click or name that, is back. And let's just line this up roughly where that is. Next thing I want to do is click on the back view here. And if we click on this window here, or this tab, excuse me, you can see that it is of type class UI view. So this is saying that this is a view. And of course, we have view controllers to control this entire view. But what I want to do is just make sure that that view is selected by clicking on this tab and ensuring that that view is selected. And then I'm going to change the background. So click on the attributes, click on the background color, and you can make it whatever color you want here. And let's just make it kind of a pale green. We also have other tabs here. Usually I like to use the crayon one just because it's a little bit more discreet rather than using that massive color controller, but depends on what you're going for. Okay, so what we want to do is hit this back button. So what we could do is create another segue to show this, but I want to do something else instead. I want to actually do this programmatically. So once this second view controller is all set up, we have a back button here. We're going to actually create a code, a view controller, which is in code for this. This first view controller already has, if we go here, back to the class view, by showing that it is ViewController, which corresponds to the file over here. So go back to our storyboard. Clicking on this second ViewController, we don't have a class for this. It's just going to use the default UI ViewController. And if you remember, UI ViewController is what this controller, or this controller over here, our custom ViewController, is inheriting from. So this one is going to use the parent, which means it doesn't have any custom code that we can use. So let's go ahead and set this up. Now there's two ways we can do this. We can right click on here and do new file, or we can select the way down here in the bottom left hand corner, there's a plus button, and we could do new file here, or we can do file, new, file here, or if you see, we have Command N. So usually Command N is what I like to use. So let's go ahead and just use our keyboard shortcut for that. So Command N, and we want to select our Cocoa Touch class as our, we can create all these other different types, but we're interested in the Cocoa Touch for our instance, because the Cocoa Touch file is going, Cocoa Touch class is going to represent this. So let's hit next on that. And the subclass of, and if you remember our first view controller inherited from UI ViewController, this one is going to do the same. So if you drop this down, you should see a list, or you can just start typing. If I do UI view, it'll kind of limit that selection to our UI view something. And so if we just type in C, it'll pop up UI ViewController. So that's one we're interested in. The second thing is it already types in here ViewController, which we cannot have a second view controller with the same name. But what this is actually doing is giving you the part after our class. So if we type in second view controller, this is going to denote that this is our second view controller. But this is how we name files in iOS and Cocoa in general. But if we had like a login view controller, this would be login view controller. If we wanted to have a view controller for our settings, we might have something called settings view controller. And again, this is just the naming convention that we have for here. We are not going to check this zip file. This is a zip file, if you're curious, is essentially one instance of this view controller. But because we're using storyboards, we have a launch screen storyboard and we have our main storyboard. Storyboards are going to be a collection of these zip files, which are different versions of nib files, if you're familiar with those. Those are next step interface bundles. We also make sure that our language is Swift, keep everything the same here. And we're going to hit next. It's going to ask us where we put it. Sometimes, for whatever reason, Xcode will default to the root directory of our project. We want to make sure that it is going to be in the subfolder, usually named the same as our project. And so you should see other Swift files in there. Sometimes that trips me up where, again, Xcode will default back to the root directory. We don't want to put it in with our Xcode project file. All right, so once we do that, it will create a whole bunch of boilerplate code for us, including our view did load and our did receive memory warning. It also has this override function for prepare for segue, and this would be for our main storyboard. We can programmatically have different custom code in this segue, so we won't be touching upon that. I know some people like to use this functionality, but I'm going to show you the programmatic way of doing it because I think it'll make more sense in the long term for you. So once we've created our second view controller here, .swift of course, we're going to select this view controller. And again, make sure that the view controller is selected by clicking on this tab, seeing that it says UI view controller. We can also make sure that on this left-hand panel here that shows up that our view controller is selected. Not the view, because if I select the view here, that gets selected, but the view controller. The easiest way is just usually clicking on this kind of bar up here, or which actually deselected it, as you can see, but selecting it here from the hierarchy as well. So again, just make sure everything is selected because it could trip you up why you're not seeing certain things here. But we're going to change the class that is driving this code from UI view controller to our second. And if we start typing this in, our autocomplete will show the rest of the class. If this does not show up for some reason, then there's something wrong with your class here. So again, make sure our autocomplete shows up. We're going to hit enter just to keep that in there. And now we have our backing file, our second view controller for this view controller in this view. All right, so what does that do? Well, we want to have this back button programmatically set in code. That code is going to live in second view controller, which is over here. We can select it there. But the easiest way to do that is actually show them side by side. So I want to see my view and I want to see my code side by side. I'm going to get rid of this panel at the bottom here. And maybe even the left or the right panel, just give us a little bit more room. And I'm going to select the assistant editor. So by selecting that, it should automatically select it, but I was messing around with the settings, so this is going to be manual. Just go ahead and click the manual and drop it down and select automatic. And you can see what automatic will select is the second view controller. I'm going to click on automatic itself. And this is going to show you second view controller. That's because we have this second view controller selected. Now, because this is set to automatic, if we select the first view controller, it'll switch our code file on the right here to view controller. Okay, so let's go ahead and select second view controller again. I'm just going to kind of center this in here. Now, we're going to need two things for this back button to work. We're going to need a reference to the back button, just in case we want to disable it or whatever. I guess we strictly don't need it, but the second thing that we do need is a function to handle when a user taps on this back button to then dismiss this view. So let's do that now. And the way that we do that is just like our segue that we initially created for our next button, we're going to hold down the control key, left click and hold on our back button and drag that off, and that's going to create a connection. And we're going to drag that connection somewhere in our file. Let's do it right below our view did load. You can see what line it's going to select. You could really put this anywhere you want, but I like to put it everything below view did load. And release your left mouse button. And it's going to pop up this little context window. And the connection it's going to try to make initially is our outlet. But we want to select that and select action because we want to create an action that gets executed when that back button is selected or tapped. So let's go ahead and select action and give it a name. I'm going to call this back was tapped. You can do anything you want really. What type is it? You can keep any. If you ever want a reference to the UI button, get its functionality by doing like dot notation and calling functions specifically on the button without having to typecast it from an any type to a UI button type. That doesn't make sense. Don't worry about it. You can select the UI button. So we can do that or keep any, doesn't really matter. The event is touch up inside. So if I release my mouse, if I tap on it and I release my finger from that button, this is the event that gets executed. You can see we have a whole bunch of other ones, such as touch up outside, which means they tapped on the button, but they dragged their finger off and released it outside of the bounds of that button. You might be interested in that event. We're not interested in this case. We're just going to keep touch up inside selected. And sender is fine. We're going to just connect that. Okay, so it's going to be an empty function. Let's give us a little bit of room here. And let's go through this really quickly. we have this annotation here called IB action. This is an interface builder action, meaning that this came as a connection from our back button into here. And so that just lets Xcode and the compiler know that there's a few things that need to go on with this, specifically this little connection here. If for whatever reason this was broken, that solid circle would not be in there. It would just be an empty, hollow circle, this outer circle here. All right, so we have a function declaration. It was back was tapped, which is what I named it. And this is going to be sender button. So we can use, we can get a reference to the button or whomever's calling this function, which is sender. And if you remember, the underscore is an unnamed function. So we don't have to say when we call this function or who, it's actually somebody else that's calling this function. They don't have to specifically name this parameter. Okay, so once we have that set up, what we're going to do is once the button is tapped, we simply want to just call dismiss. So type in dismiss. It should come up in our autocomplete. The first one is what we want, and then hit enter. Xcode is going to place our placeholder, our cursor right on this placeholder for bool. Do we want this animated? Do we want the ViewController or the view to just dismiss instantly? Or do we want an animation? So you can put true or false in there. I want to put true to show the animation. And then I'm going to hit control forward slash to jump over to the next placeholder. And this is going to be the completion block. It's going to ask for a block of code in this place right here for getting executed after the animation is done. So the animation might take a second, it might take a half a second, whatever it's going to take. Do you want anything to happen once that ViewController is dismissed? Not in our case, so we're going to put nil. Nil is the equivalent of null if you're used to other programming languages. So that's just what we use both in Objective-C and in Swift. All right, so that's all we're going to do for here. Let's go ahead and actually put a breakpoint there just to show you that that line of code is going to get executed. And let's go ahead and play our application here. I'm going to take a second to compile, put it up on the simulator, and it's going to hit our first breakpoint here because I guess we turned it on. I'm not interested in this breakpoint anymore, so I'm going to click and drag this off to delete it. And once we have our breakpoint, we can hit our play button. So hit play, and it's going to show us our reversed ViewController. Hit the next, it's going to slide up that second one, and then now we're going to hit the back button to dismiss it, but it's going to hit the breakpoint first. So if we hit back, here is Xcode jumping to our code, and we can switch back to our editor so that we have this whole all the code showing in our full screen. And it's going to execute this line of code. And so if I step over by hitting this button way down here, it's going to step over the line of code. And let's switch back to our simulator. You can see that nothing's happened yet because it's still in our run loop. Our run loop hasn't updated the interface yet. And we're just going to hit play through that. And it dismissed that. But you didn't get to see that because things were changing so quickly. So let's go ahead and remove this, click and drag and remove that breakpoint. Switch back to our simulator, hit the next button, hit the back button, next button, back button, next button, back button. So you get the idea of how we can switch between view controllers. So I hope you found this video useful. In future videos, we'll make this a lot more complicated, but now that we have the basics of creating view controllers and jumping back and forth between them, then we can get into more complex things as sending information back and forth, setting up more complex widgets such as text fields, gathering information from those text fields such as a username and password, etc., etc. So we got a long ways to go, but certainly stick around. Watch the previous videos if you haven't watched those already, and be sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.